According to the cloud. Okay, now it says it's recording. So, great. I will get started. Sorry, everybody who had to watch that. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Lunch and Learn. I'm Allison Marcioni. I'm the Programs Director at the Upper Valley Land Trust, and I want to thank you for attending today. We have a really interesting presentation for you. Before we get started, I want to let everyone know that I'm recording this. I think you all know now I'm recording this, and it will be available on our YouTube channel after the presentation. So I'm excited to welcome you to, I had a 12,000 year, but it looks like it's a 13,000 year long history.
I had to go back and relook at the data.
13,000 year long history of Smith Pond from pond bottom sediments. So today we have Meredith Kelly, Associate Professor of Earth Sciences at Dartmouth College, and Edward Meyer, Senior Lecturer and Research Scientist in the Department of Earth Scientists at Dartmouth College. I'm going to quickly read through your bios for everybody's benefit. Meredith is a geologist and developed her love for this field during her undergraduate research in the Merrimack Valley. She studies evidence for past glacier extents expressed in landscape features and has the ability to determine the ages of these features using a few different geochemical methods. She is developing records of past glacial extents in Greenland, Peru, and Uganda, and using these to understand the mechanisms of past climate change. She also reconstructs past ice sheet extents to investigate the sensitivity of ice sheets to climate change. One of her favorite projects is right here in the Upper Valley, where she uses both landscape features and sediments from local lakes to reconstruct the history of the Laurentide ice sheet that covered the area, as well as climate conditions in the area since deglaciation. Ed is a geoscientist with a background in tectonics, petrology, the study of rock types, and geochemistry. His research focuses on the tectonic evolution of New England and the climate story contained in the sedimentary record of Precambrian rocks in Western North America and the Arctic. In addition, he teaches courses that cover introductory and advanced level topics related to the solid Earth. Ed has a particular interest in promoting accessible field experiences for undergraduates, and he serves as the director of the long-term Dartmouth Earth Science field program called The Stretch. In his courses, he enjoys introducing students to the remarkable geologic story that is vividly spelled out in the rocks and sediments of the Upper Valley through field trips and local projects. He lives with his family in Thetford, Vermont. Okay, just a couple housekeeping things before we get started. I am going to ask everyone to stay on mute for the presentation so we don't have any disruptive noises or feedback. And if you have questions, which I hope that you will, please type them into the chat box, and then when the presentation's over, I'll go through the questions and ask them to Meredith and Ed. So without further ado, let's get started.
Great, thanks so much, Allison. Thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm super excited to talk about this work that we've done on Smith Pond. Ed and I are sort of going to be trading off throughout the presentation here, and ideally we're going to keep it as short as possible so there's plenty of time for discussion. So we're happy to talk more about anything that we sort of touch on in this talk or other questions that you have. Okay, so let me start with just a few acknowledgements. It was really this particular project on Smith Pond was made possible by the Upper Valley Land Trust, so we're really grateful for their help with accessing and permission to conduct the work that we did at this site. Particularly Jason Berard and Allison here were really amazing with that. They were also both out on the ice with us that day and helping with some of the scientific studies that we did. Dr. Greg Baker owns some land that is adjacent to the Smith Pond and was incredibly helpful. He allowed us to use his incredible ATV that we used to bring in literally probably 100 or more pounds of gear, and all of our students. Some of them walked, but a lot of them got rides in and out to the site. It happened to be a very cold day, the day that we were working out there, so it was really nice to have the transport, and it was a long day. It made it possible to do what we were doing. Also, Steve Arconi, who's at Crowell, helped with the GPR, was instrumental in doing the GPR, and Peter Thompson, who is doing a lot of the local bedrock mapping around here, was a great asset to have on the team as well. So the reason we did these projects initially, I mean, I have a larger interest in this, in the the sediment records in lakes in this area, but the reason we started these projects was because of these two classes that I teach and that Ed teaches. So these are both undergraduate classes offered in winter term of 2020. Mine was called Earth's Climate, Past, Present, and Future, and Ed's is called Marine Geology. And for my class, I usually take a sediment core from one of the local ponds or lakes around here, and we use that as sort of the framework for our laboratory work during that class. But Ed and I thought this year it'd be really fun to join up classes and work together on sort of two aspects of understanding the lake basin, sedimentation of lake basin, and then reading the sediment record that's preserved in the lake. So some people associated with those classes, a graduate TA, graduate student TA is Nate Anderson, and then Kevin Alexander, Jordy Geyer, and Abigail Lambert were students who particularly provided data for the presentation today. Okay, so I'll start out with really the overall goal of the project is to understand the local geology and the environmental conditions in the region since the end of the last ice age. And this is sort of combining two aspects of what's contained in the lake. So we're trying to see how this lake formed, what does the bedrock look like, what is the shape of that bedrock, and then also investigate what's lying on top of that bedrock, which is sediment that has been transported to and deposited in that lake over time. And the cool thing about New England that I absolutely love, and I feel so fortunate to be able to work and live in this area, is that the sediments in these lakes oftentimes go back all the way to the end of the last ice age. So the time when there's a 2,000 meter thick ice sheet over this area 20,000 years ago, and that melted and receded northward from us about 14,000 years ago. And since then, these lakes have existed as these basins that just collect material, and we can use that material to look at how environment in this area has changed over that time. So our two main goals are here. The first is something that Ed will talk about in his class worked on. This is the understanding the bathymetry. And if you don't know what that word means, it's essentially depth in a body of water. It can be bathymetry in an ocean or bathymetry in a lake is the depth of that body of water. And then the thickness and type of sediments overlying the bedrock. And then what I'm interested in is, sorry, this is the cool machine that Ed uses to get these data to interpret bathymetry. And then what I was doing with my class was trying to obtain and analyze lake bottom sediments. And this is sort of our setup here. And I'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a little bit. So we did most of this work. We did a little bit of preliminary work, checking out the site, getting out there with Jason and seeing the access and testing some of the chemistry of the water and stuff. And then we did most of this work on January 22nd, 2020, which, as you know, feels like an age ago. Okay, so let me start with one question first to bring us sort of into the site itself. So why Smith Pond? So to me, the lakes around here, as I mentioned, are really interesting because they preserve this record of environments over time and how those environments have changed. Smith Pond turned out to be a great site for this. As you probably know, so these are two maps from Smith Pond. Let me start with that. This is a New Hampshire state map that shows the bathymetry of the lake. And this is a map that one of my students found in the Dartmouth Library from 1893 that shows Mascoma Lake here and the location where Smith Pond is about here. So Smith Pond today is located just south of Lake Mascoma, and it's at about 1,600 feet elevation. So it's pretty high, set up on these bedrock hills of Montcalm. And therefore it's interesting to me because it really, like, as soon as the ice sheet retreated, this basin formed, or this basin existed in the landscape and started to fill with sediments. And so one of the first questions is, was that lake there the whole time? Was that depression that could catch sediments there the whole time since the end of the last ice age? Are we going to be able to get a record from there that will tell us about environments over time? And this sort of suite of maps to some extent answers that question, and it's a little bit of a complicated point, but it makes it an interesting story. So as you can see now, Smith Pond is quite large. and occupies sort of multiple basins here. But back in 1893, it didn't. It was just this little tiny pond here. And then there are these other, what are called lily ponds over here that I think are probably these here. So in the late 1800s, the Shakers who were living in this area dammed this pond and set up a series of canals. So those canals existed here, but then they put some dams here to make this pond even bigger. And that's sort of why Smith Pond has its form today. So when I'm thinking about getting these sediment records, I'm always a little bit shy of dammed ponds because I'm not sure that they were always a basin or a basin that would collect and preserve material. But based on this map, it really looked like there was a deeper part of this pond that had existed as a lake prior to damming. And therefore we decided to go for that. But we really wanted to target this deep area that was shown in the bathymetric map. And then also Ed's work with the GPR helped determine where we were actually going to core and where that sort of deep spot of the pond is. So I guess those are my reasons. I mean, there's a little bit more of a complicated story that if you know the glacial history of this area, you might know that the Connecticut Valley was filled with a large lake called Glacial Lake Hitchcock at the end of the last ice age. Well, Lily Pond was way above that lake. And so it enables us to get a perspective on deglaciation here that was like literally right after the ice sheet left, which to me was something that the time in Earth's history when climate was changing very rapidly, that I'm interested in understanding how environmental change was happening. And do you want to add anything to that about why you wanted to focus on Smith Pond or anything that I missed?
I think that's a pretty good summary. I guess you might be asking why I was focused on Smith Pond in a marine geology class, and in part that is because the marine geology class at Dartmouth is offered in the winter term, and it's not a very good time to actually go do anything on the ocean. And so this was an opportunity to get students some exposure to the types of things that you might do in a marine setting, but instead using a lake setting. And I think that also we have the potential to contribute to Meredith's data set by using this ground penetrating radar that I'll talk about in a second to investigate sediment over a broader area than a single sediment core.
Great. Okay, so let me move to this. This is a zoomed in image of the New Hampshire state map. Again, just showing this is bathymetry, so depth in the lake. Those contours on here in feet, I'll change to meters. So the deepest part of the lake is about 10 meters deep. There is a road here that is not open to the public, but we were able to access it with the Dr. Greg Baker's ATV, and then we sort of had a staging area for going on and off the ice here, if you're familiar with the pond setting. And then these two sort of northern edges of the pond here where the dams were built that allowed the pond to sort of occupy a greater area than that initial area. Anything else you want to mention here, Ed?
That probably covers it.
Okay. All right. So I'll hand it over to you to talk about GPR.
Okay. So I'll start this by saying that I am not an expert in ground penetrating radar. And in fact, this was my first experience using it. And I really want to make sure that we appropriately credit the person who is actually an expert and who's an Upper Valley resident, and that's Steve Arconi. And this is really a technique that he developed while working as a graduate student and then for the US Army Corps of Engineers Cold Regions Research Lab. So Steve was there with us almost every step of the way and deserves a lot of credit for what I'm showing here today. And I'll tell you a little bit about how ground penetrating radar works. The heart of the machine, so to speak, is really this box here. And this box contains two things. It contains a radar antenna and emitter that sends out a pulse. And in our case, that pulse is a pulse at 100 megahertz. And it contains in that box also a receiver that collects reflections of that pulse that come back to the device. So basically how this thing works is, if this is our ground penetrating radar here, it sends out a pulse. That pulse of energy at 100 megahertz interacts with things in the subsurface. So in a lake that's frozen over, it might interact with the ice at the top of the lake. It might interact very mildly with the water. And then it will reflect off of hard surfaces like the bottom of the lake, where the water meets the sediment. And then it might reflect off layers within the sediment. So it gives us a really nice picture of what the sediment looks like in 2 dimensions. And then it'll also interact with things like solid rock that underlies the entire lake basin. So in the end, we get a nice, we basically tow this piece of equipment across the lake in a straight line at a very steady speed. And in the end, we get a nice 2-dimensional image of water depth, sediment depth, sediment structure. So are there layers in the sediment? Are there faults, things like that, using this 2-way travel time from a radar that we're towing. So this is really working in a very similar way to like an echo sounder, except it's powerful enough to actually penetrate into the sediment and down to the bedrock. So we collected 11 GPR transects with my class. And again, you can see that most of these are in a relatively straight line. One of the things that we initially had to do was locate the start and endpoint of each transect very precisely. So we used a commercial GPS system called a Differential GPS. And the reason we did this is that this system allows us to position the start and end points of each transect with about a centimeter of error. If you were doing this with a consumer-based GPS unit, you'd be more in the multiple meters of accuracy. So this is a very accurate GPS system and lets us know exactly where our transects start and end. And then again, we're just walking very steadily between the start and end point, collecting data. So let's take a look at what that data actually looks like. So this is a GPR profile. This is that 2D data set that's been processed in a software package to make it actually look like something that we can interpret. And you can see that one of the students in the class here has done a fair bit of interpretation of this image, and that's what all these labels are. I'll just show where this image was collected. So this image started here, and we walked, again, steadily across the pond to here. So this is our transect 9. And let's take a look at what we actually see in this image. So all of this material up here is actually the water that has filled the pond basin. And the yellow line represents the first real strong return that we're getting from this radar pulse at each point. And that strong return is the sediment water interface. So we can say that's basically the profile of the lake bottom. And it's relatively flat, but you can see there are a couple features that stick up, like this feature right here. That probably represents some little piece of bedrock that sticks up out of the bottom of the lake. And when you're considering things like collecting sediment cores, that would be a good place to avoid. So beneath the sediment water interface, we see a lot of fine layers, for instance, in this area. And those fine layers probably represent a mixture of organic material and coarser sediment of the silt size. They have been interpreted to be, the coarser layers have been interpreted to be deposits of silt that maybe originate near the edges of the lake and are carried down into the lake basin, possibly during storm events or during very small earthquakes that occurred after ice retreated from the landscape of the upper valley. That ice had kind of pushed the landscape down, and when the ice disappeared, the landscape bounced back and there were lots of small earthquakes. So the interpretation is that these layers that we see here may originate from either storms or these earthquakes. And storms would bring in sediment, basically washing sediment from off of the land. The other interesting thing that we can see in this data is highlighted by this red line, and that marks basically the next kind of real prominent contact here, and that is the suspected contact between sediment and the actual underlying rock. So the sediment is loose and you could take your hand and scoop it out. The underlying rock is lithified and solid. There is also the potential to interpret what types of sediment you're looking at. So in some instances, you can see sediment that is of very mixed grain size. So it's got everything from like little tiny particles to boulders in it. Those are sediments that are often deposited by glaciers. And we might call that glacial till. That has a very distinctive pattern in these GPR profiles. So the students here have interpreted some things as glacial till. I'm not actually sure that I fully agree with them, but that is also something that you can possibly interpret in these profiles. So that's profile 9. That doesn't actually go near where we cored, but we did collect a profile that went very close to the site that Meredith's group actually cored. And that's profile 3 here. That starts right here. It's a pretty long profile and ends right here. Meredith's coring operation was that a good location for it? Somewhere right about there. You can see that this is the location of Meredith's core right here, going down through the sediments. That core reached about 18 meters depth below the water surface. And you can see that there's lots of fine laminations in the GPR profile here. And that suggests that this is a good place to core, that we have a nice thick column of sediment here where we're going to get a nice long continuous record. And another piece of information that we got by using this GPR is that we did not see a lot of evidence for glacial till, which might have big blocks that would be difficult to core through at shallow depth right below the sediment water interface. Okay.
Good.
Anything you want to add there, Meredith?
No, I think I'll take it in and describe the coring now.
Okay.
Then we can come back and
yeah,
together at the end. Okay, great. Oh no, we forgot this one.
Yeah. One of the products that we produced that was, I think, useful for potential future endeavors on this pond is a depth to bedrock map. And this map is essentially a map that shows where there are bedrock depressions in the bottom of the pond. And some of those depressions are totally filled in with sediment. So these depressions over here are totally filled in with sediment. So you might not know that they exist unless you used the ground penetrating radar to see that those are areas where the sediment is quite thick. So those would be potential spots for future coring endeavors. Okay, now I think I'll pass it over to Meredith.
Do you want to compare that to the state map at all? Or what, to show what you've done here?
Yeah, so there's one other piece of data that we collected using the GPR. So the state map that Meredith showed back at, let's see, can we get back to that slide? Yep, there it is. The state map that Meredith showed earlier in the talk here is a map that shows the depth of the water in the pond. And this is a map that was probably built using an echo sounder. It's a pretty coarse data set, and it shows a couple deep spots right here. One of the things that the GPR allowed us to do is to further enhance this map. So we combine data from the state map and the ground penetrating radar water depths to build a new, more high resolution bathymetry map. And that is also useful in thinking about where thick deposits of sediment might be in terms of future coring sites. So those are kind of the data products that my class produced.
Great, thanks. Okay, so I'm going to pick up here and talk about the coring and the sediments that we got out of the lake. I'll start talking about just the system of how we cored. So I guess maybe I'll go back and use Ed's map here. So we were interested in coring in the deepest part of the lake because that I make an assumption that that would be the part of the lake where if the climate got warmer and drier and the lake level lowered a little bit, there might still be water in there. The problem is if the lake dries out completely, you can start to erode material at the bottom of the lake, and that would leave us with a record that isn't complete. There would be some missing time in that record. So we want a record that's been under, or a basin that's been underwater for the whole time that we're aiming to look at. So we record basically right in this deep hole here. Or over that, and this is our setup. So everything that we do is pretty much hand powered. We do use an electric auger to drill holes in the lake ice. Those are down here. So we drill a couple big, like 10.25 inch holes in the lake ice. And then we set up, this is what I call our coring tower. And it's basically a tower that has a winch and cables on it that are attached to a clamp that we use to hook the core into, and we can basically drive that core up and down in and out of the lake as we need. And there's got to be some, counter pressure to that or counter tension on that. So we attach this tower into the ground here with some ice screws, and then with these tethers out, also with some more ice screws. So it's a great setup because we have a lot of power to get down into the lake sediment. Sometimes, the top of the sediments are pretty goopy, but once you get into deeper sediments and into like particularly glacial sediments, they can be very stiff and sort of sticky clays. And so it can take a lot of force to drive through those and also then to extract them back out. This is the coring in action. So we basically have a system of rods. So I have 2-meter long rods. You can see them sort of laid out across the orange sleds here. And I screw those rods onto basically a hollow cylinder that has a piston in it. And the piston is basically like a mechanism so that if you imagine if that cylinder is a straw and I'm pushing that straw into the sediment, I want to be able to put my thumb on the end of that straw so that when I pull that straw up, everything that's in it doesn't fall out. And that's sort of the piston mechanism there. But on that cylinder, it's a 1-meter-long cylinder. I can attach as many rods as I want. I think I have something like 20 rods. So I have, and they're each 2 meters long. So I have 40 meters of ability to go down into lake water and then into the lake sediment on top of that meter core. And I basically attach what I need, go down, we push down into the sediments, bring that core barrel or that core up full of sediment, and then extrude the sediment out and then go back down and get more. And we keep doing that until we can't do it anymore. And in Smith Pond, that was at about, the water depth is about 10 meters. And we cored down to about 18 meters. So we got about 8 meters of sediment out of the bottom of the lake before we couldn't core anymore. This is showing the core itself here, the core barrel, aluminum sort of hollow barrel with a piston in the end of it. And this is a core being extruded or pushed out of that core barrel. We do that onto a piece of wood. We wrap it up in saran wrap. We take some initial measurements, make an initial description of it, wrap it up in sediments, put it in a nice PVC casing so that we can carry it back on a sled and bring it safely back into the lab where we analyze it. This is what one of the cores looks like when it comes out. These are the students. Here's Jordy Geyer, Abigail Lambert, Kevin Alexander, some of the people who provided data today for today's presentation. This is a core, it's about 1 meter long, so it's a full coring tube. The top of the core is up here. The bottom of the core, so this would be lower down in the lake, is down here. And many of the cores look like this. You can imagine it's like lake bottom mud. It's the stuff that squishes between your toes when you accidentally step in the bottom of a lake when you're swimming. And I'll talk more about that sediment. It's really neat sediment. And then this was sort of for me, one of the really cool cores. This is right at the bottom. This is about core meter 7 in the core. So this is the top of the core. This is that sort of lake bottom mud, what we typically find in New England lakes. There's a lot of brown to it. That means there's a lot of organic material in it. And what we see is this transition here, whoops, from brown to gray. And that transition is showing us this huge climate change that happened at the end of the last ice age. So this is sediment that's mostly clay and silt and has very little organic material in it. And that was a time when there was just not a lot of organic material on the landscape, basically right after the ice sheet retreated from this area. And then we can see that progressive change up here to more organic conditions like the conditions we know today. So I want to talk about a few of the analyses we can do on this core, and I'm happy to talk more about these. I want to give a sort of a brief overview and not take too long. So one of the main things we want to know first is how much core do we get? What does it look like? And then how old is it? So we can do this cool method called radiocarbon dating, where we actually find an organic piece in the core, something that contains carbon, and we can measure the amount of radiocarbon in it. And that I'm happy to explain this method a little bit more. I won't go into detail now. That can tell us actually when that organic material sort of died, if it was a plant, if it's an insect, when it stopped taking in carbon dioxide, either from the air or from something it was eating. So we've done this at 2 places in the core. These are shown here. So at 10.84 meters, and this is below the lake surface now. And again, that lake water is about 10 meters deep. So just below where the sediment started, about 84 centimeters into the sediment, we found a macrofossil, an actual leaf of a plant that had died and washed into the lake. And we could date that, and they came out to be about 1,900 years ago. This is a funky unit that we use to talk about radiocarbon ages. And it's actually you can just think about it as years. It's actually before 1950 as a reference here. So that point's here. That's about 1900 years ago at about 11 meters depth. And then the next part of the core that we could date, I wanted to get a date that was lower down in the core, down towards the end of the core. And there wasn't as much sort of individual pieces of organic material that we could identify. So I took what we call a bulk age, which is basically saying there's a lot of carbon in that core, decayed organic material. I can't identify it, but I'm going to take enough of it so that I can just basically take a spoonful of it, a little spoonful of it, and send that off for a measurement. I did that at 17.3 meters. That's what I call bulk sediment here. And that age came back to be 12,448. This is plus 104 minus 308 years before 1950. And that point's down here. I added a couple other points on here. These are my assumed points. So I assume that the top of the lake sediment, where that boundary is between the bottom of the lake water and the top of the sediment, I assume that's 0 for an age that's modern. That's not always a correct assumption, but it's an assumption we can make. And then I also took just the rate of sediment accumulation here and assumed it was similar below this radiocarbon age, and extended that age depth model out to the bottom of the core, which is about 18 meters. And that gives us a basal age, bottom of the core age, about 13,200. So that's what we can say about the age of the core, which to me is really cool. We know that from other data, at least in the Connecticut River Valley, the ice retreated through the Connecticut River Valley, sort of between Hanover, right around Hanover, at about 14,000 years ago. So this is quite close to that age. That means that this sedimentation in this lake, we're getting back to just at the end of the last ice age. So one of the analyses that my students do is something that I call visual stratigraphy. And that's a complicated way of basically saying we're going to look at each layer of this core and describe what that layer looks like. So it's visual, we're describing it. Is it brown? Is it gray? Is it made up of big sediments or little sediments? Can you see plants? Can you see rocks? Stuff like that, visual. And stratigraphy just means the layering of it. How is this layer cake built? And so this is a stratigraphy that a couple students put together for their final project. This is broken into 2. I apologize for that. I couldn't fit it on the slide. So this is the top of the core here at the depth below the lake surface at 10.4 meters. And this is the bottom of the core here. And it's basically split here and starts again up here. So what you can see is that what they've illustrated is that most of this core is this really funky looking brown material. And this is a great material that we have an incredible name for. It's a Swedish name, and you can see it written here. It's called gyttja. It's really fun to say. If you haven't ever said it, it just feels good. And gyttja is basically it's a Swedish term. There are a lot of lakes in Sweden, which is I think why it came from there. And it basically means organic rich mud. So there's mostly organic material, decomposed organic material in here that's mixed with a little bit of clay and silt. But that's a lot of what exists for most of this core. And then there's a transition here in about 17 or so, 17.3 meters, and that transitions into that, what I showed before, that gray color with not very much organic in it, organic sediment in it, that's mostly silt and clay. And then I'll show you it's super cool right at the bottom. There's some other evidence that I'll show you that's really cool. There are these layers in here that students were able to identify that are distinct layers where there's very little organic material associated with them, but there's silt and clay, and I'll talk about what we think those are. So this is one of the analyses, and we sort of put this together with the radiocarbon dating to have a perspective on what the core looks like. So what I'd like to do in the next couple slides is just walk you through what these sediments look like from the bottom to the top and give you a better idea and pictures of what these look like. And then I'll show one more piece of data and then we'll wrap up. So this is the bottom of the core. This is at about 17.5 to 18 meters depth. And this is the same view. It's just sort of up close in this picture here. And so this is the core. We bring the core back into the lab and we basically split it open lengthwise so we can have a fresh surface to look at. And what we found at the bottom here is really cool. These are, this is silt and clay, but it has rocks in it. There's actually right here in this circle is a piece, it's like a pebble. It's an angular pebble that is composed of a local rock that we call the Littleton Formation. It's a phyllite, which is a metamorphosed mudstone or so. And basically the bottom of the core is glacial till, which is super cool. I don't often have this when we go coring, and we actually got into the till. We got packed all the way through the lake sediment into the sediment that was placed in there by a glacier. So we can call this sediment poorly sorted. Some people use the term diamicted. If we know it's deposited by a glacier, which I think we do, we can call it a till. Just to mention, I'll show in a couple slides some other data. Those were collected with these little holes. So students take a little plugger and take little samples out of the core, and that's what you're seeing with these holes here. So if we move up a little bit in the core, here's where you can see that transition from gray glacial sediment at the bottom up here into much more organic rich, what I call gyttja, organic rich mud. And this is the space where we took the bulk sample for radiocarbon dating. And that came back about 12,500 years ago. And so it's really interesting. Technically, the time when Earth transitioned into the current interglacial state is about 11,500 years ago. So this transition here to me shows us that Smith Pond was getting more organic production in the pond. It was getting more organic material transported into the lake from the landscape, and in the pond itself, there were more living things that were producing and then dying and creating this organic material. So that was happening pretty early on here. That was happening maybe as far back as even like 13,000 years ago. And then, so that to me is a pretty early warming of this area as far as we understand sort of regional records of climate, which is cool. And then I'll move up a little bit more and show you, oops, I'm sorry, I had to show that quiet here. Let's get those out here now. So I want to move up in the core. So this is now a little bit higher up in the core. This is between about 14 and 15 meters depth. And this is now in sort of what we understand about our interglacial conditions. This is Smith Pond as we could imagine it back in the before 1890, whatever, when it was dammed. It was a lake. It had a lot of organic production in it, and you can see most of this is that brown yicha, but there are these really cool layers that are composed of clay and very fine silt. You can see one here, and one here. And so those represent these three in the visual stratigraphy that the students put together. But as you can see, there are many of these through here. And I've seen these in a couple lakes around in this area, and I don't know, can't pinpoint exactly what they are yet. My hunch is that they're probably a storm event, a time when there was a large storm on the landscape, something like Irene, that would wash a lot of sediment into the landscape so that you'd have a fast sediment accumulation where you didn't have that much time for like organic material to be washed in, a lot of decomposing carbon to be washed in. So those are pretty cool, and those are something I'd like to sort of keep working on and keep thinking about in the future. Lastly, I want to just show, this is my last slide and then we'll wrap up. And I want to show one other analysis that we can do, and this is something that I call loss on ignition. And so we basically, throughout the core, we can take a little sample of that sediment and we weigh that sample, and then we can put it in the oven and burn it at like 500 degrees C. And when you burn something at 500 degrees C, it combusts all of the organic matter, so that if we weigh the sample after it's been burned, we can calculate how much has been lost. So this is the amount of organic material that's been lost, or the amount of material that's been lost on ignition that we can interpret to be percent organic matter. And I plotted this as so this is percent up here. So it's generally ranges between 30 and let's call it 60% organic matter in the core. This is like sort of our current, interglacial conditions, what Smith Pond productivity looks like. This is the drop off into that gray silt and clay. The more glacial like sediment has very, very low organic content to it. And we can see the timing of when that happened. But the other thing that I think that is interesting about these sediments is that there is some kind of sort of trend to this. And what I've noticed in lakes around here is that at this time, sort of in 10,000 to 5,000 years ago, it looks like that there was more organic material in these lakes, and that sort of from 5,000 years ago until the present has declined. So I think that is also telling us something about sort of the recent, what I call as a geologist, recent climate and environment in this area. Okay, so this is our wrap up. I'll finish up here, and then I think Ed and I are both happy to just take any questions you have about this. Some of our conclusions, Ed, do you want to take a dive at that?
Sure. So what we gathered by doing the ground penetrating radar study of the lake is that the lake is filled with sediment that is a mixture of organic material and those fine lighter colored layers that Meredith just showed you. And those are probably mostly made of silt or very fine sand. And you see those in Meredith's core, but in the ground penetrating radar data, you can see how those behave over a broad area of the lake and how expansive they are. So we get a sense of whether sediment layers are continuous or discontinuous, and that helps us to interpret what may have caused those sand and silt layers to form, whether they represent sediment washed in by storms, or other people have hypothesized that they are sediment slumps triggered by these earthquakes. And then the two other pieces that we gathered from the ground penetrating radar were a better bathymetry map, so we can figure out where the deepest basins are in the lake with more accuracy, and a map showing how deep bedrock sits below the sediment. And that's useful for thinking about where there are thick accumulations of sediment. And it's possible that you might have a depression in the bedrock that's totally filled in with sediment so that you don't see it in the water depth map. And so this depth of bedrock is a valuable piece of information for potential future coring endeavors.
So from the sediment coring end of things, we we were able to obtain this incredible sediment record that goes back to about 13,000 years ago. There's glacial till at the bottom telling us that we got all the way back, sort of in my sense of geologic time, to the end of the last ice age. We have this really amazing record of the transition from glacial to interglacial conditions that happened, in my mind, pretty early, about by 12,500 years ago. And the interglacial, this sort of current state of Smith Pond over the last about 10,000 years, has some really interesting changes in the percent organic matter, and also those layers of silt and clay that may represent storm events. So there's, to me, a lot of like fun work that could continue on these sediments and potentially with future cores from the lake. So with that, let me finish and take any questions and talk potentially about what we could do in the future too. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you guys for that presentation. Really interesting stuff. So we have one question in the chat right now from Andrew that says, given that you can walk out on the ice at Smith Pond, can you do this kind of research on lakes that do not freeze, like lakes in the south that may not ever freeze?
Yeah, that's a great question. So some of my work, as Allison mentioned, is I do work doing similar types of methodologies in Uganda and in Peru, and those are places certainly where the lakes never freeze. So we do have a setup where we basically have a raft that has two inflatable pontoons and like a metal frame in between, and we can set up the coring system on that. And that is a way to core. It's and similarly, I think with Ed, the GPR can be set up and towed from a boat or on a boat. I'm not exactly sure. You probably need some kind of inflatable raft to put the GPR unit in. I have to say though, it's a lot. You drop a lot fewer things in the lake when you're able to stand on lake ice.
Really convenient.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to core on ice. Although this coring this last winter was challenging because it was a warm winter and there had been a lot of rain, like repeated episodes of rain that I think had made the lake ice not as stable as I'm used to. And I was really nervous bringing a bunch of students out there. We were fine in the end, but like we did have one cracking episode that made me really nervous. We also, I should mention, have safety ropes set up. Like one of our safety lines you can see is here and goes way off to some ice screws that are set up. So if everything went down, we do have somewhat of a backup plan.
I remember I was really nervous walking out there because I don't like going out on ice ever. And you were like, and here's the safety line for if you fall through. And I was like, oh my God. So, but it was really exciting to see what you guys were doing out there. We don't have any questions in the chat. Oh, someone just put one in actually. Can you tell anything about the origin of the organic material from the cores?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, there are a couple ways we can do that. There are things that are identifiable that come in. Like we can just with your eye, you can see things in there like pine cones, pine needles, leaves. We've once found like a fish bone. It's, you know, sometimes it's like a needle in a haystack, what you're going to get there, right? But we can find pieces of wood. There's some really cool stuff that we pulled out of cores that you can just see. We also can make microscopic slides. We just take a little bit of the mud and smear it on a slide, and you can look at that in a microscope, and then you can see things like insects. You can see pollen. You can see like smaller bits of plant that you might not be able to see. We see like insect wings. We see like larvae of midges and all these cool things. But a lot of it is like a mush, like a brown mush that you can't see. And I assume that most of that is like, you know, degrading, decomposing plant material, probably plant material that actually grew in the lake. Some of that plant material might have been transported in from the landscape on the around the lake. And there are some like more technical isotopic methods you can use by looking at like the carbon isotopes. Carbon has a couple different isotopes, and plants that grow in water have different carbon isotopes than plants that grow on land. So you can look at like the carbon isotopes in the sediments and try to pull out whether there was a more influence of plants that grew in water versus plants that go on the land.
I'm curious, do you have an idea of what the reason for the amount of organic matter, why it's declining?
I don't. I mean, well, I mean, so that's not exactly true. In the way that climate has operated over the past couple million years, the ice age cycles that we've been having, there's a general warming and cooling pattern, sort of a sinusoid pattern that's driven by changes in Earth's orbit, and the amount of the consequent amount of solar radiation received on Earth. And the 10,000 years ago, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, that was a time of high solar radiation received relatively. I mean, this is very small differences. And then that declined over the last 10,000 years. So that decline is what should be pushing us into the next ice age. So right now we are sort of at the end of the current ice age and should be going into the next ice age. That probably isn't going to happen. But that decline probably drove some of this. There has been an overall cooling trend in the Northern Hemisphere over the last 10,000 years, driven by these changes in incoming solar radiation.
Okay. Another question here. How do the Smith Pond cores compare to the ones at Antarctica age-wise?
Yeah, so it's a really great question. There are all different kinds of cores we can take. So some people in Antarctica can take lake cores. There are lakes around the ice sheet there, and those the ice sheet was also big in Antarctica during the last glacial period. So those cores in lakes around Antarctica probably date back to a similar time when the ice sheet retreated, maybe between 20 and 15,000 years ago, maybe even younger than that. But people also take cores from ice in a similar style, right? You go down with a barrel, drill into ice, bring up that meter, go back down, get another meter, keep going back down until you get through the whole ice sheet. And those cores in Antarctica go back to almost 1 million years now of ice. So those are really incredible, and climate records, and they provide information about everything that's deposited on that ice. So it's a little bit more of like an atmospheric record rather than something that's deposited in a lake.
Very cool. What future places are you planning to go for your research?
It's a great question. I mean, I think, I sort of outlined some of the questions I'm interested in terms of like defining these questions. Or first we get the question, then we figure out where we need to go to answer that question, right? So one of the questions I have is about the end of the last ice age. How did that transition happen from glacial to interglacial conditions? To me, this is the largest natural global warming event that we have in recent history, and we ought to understand it well, to have a better understanding of where we're going in the future and how climate mechanisms operate. And so understanding that transition is really important, and there's some really cool records of how that happened in New England in these lakes. And then we also have the ice sheet retreating through the area, so we can compare the records from the lakes to what the ice sheet was doing and figure out how climate and the ice sheet were interacting. So I feel like finding more of these lakes and getting a couple reproducible records where we can document that transition, really capture that time in a lake core, in lake sediments, is a big goal of mine. And these sort of higher elevation lakes that were out of Glacial Lake Hitchcock or above Glacial Lake Hitchcock, so you get really that record of the ice sheet leaving and what climate was like after that. Something like Smith Pond is great. Ed and I were tossing, when we were putting this together, we were tossing around the idea of trying to get into Muskoma, see if we could core Muskoma. Although to me, like, my coring system's made for something that's like probably not more than 20 to 25 meters deep. It gets really hard to core after that in terms of lake water. But other high lakes, we've cored Post Pond and Ockham Pond, but those are both below Glacial Lake Hitchcock. So we get the Glacial Lake Hitchcock record, but then we don't really understand about the ice sheet. Yeah.
Is there a next step for Smith Pond? Is there more you'd like to do there?
Yeah, let me hand this over to Ed and give you a chance to.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested to go back and do additional GPR transects across some of the places where water flows into the pond to try to get a sense of what structures exist in those environments. So those would be things that are kind of similar to very small scale delta features. And I think it would be an interesting comparison to what we see out in the deeper part of the lake.
Yeah, so I mean, in addition to that, I feel like if we could core in those sites, like one of my questions is these layers of silt and clay that exist when there's typically just the yicha, the brown organic material. I think those are storm layers, but I haven't really been able to prove that yet. And so one way to do it would be to go near and take a core near where sediment's being transported into the lake and see if we can find those layers, and if they're actually coarser near where sediment comes into the lake, or they're thicker there, we could potentially, trace those out there. And then, if we document them as storm events, then it's a good question of like, how many big storms do we have like that typically? And, what's the frequency of them? And is there any relation to climate mechanisms that are going on? So understanding those events, I think, is really interesting. And there's a great record of them in Smith Pond that we know now. So I think doing more work on like just focusing on those, or like using the coring combined with the GPR to try to trace those layers across the lake. If we could identify those layers in the GPR.
I think it's possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there has been this debate about, what drives those layers out into the deep part of the lake.
That sounds really cool.
There's so many questions.
Awesome. One more question from the group here. You said we should be heading into the next ice age, but probably won't. Does that mean global warming isn't all bad?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So global warming has happened in the past. It's definitely a natural process, right? The end of the last ice age was a large global warming. The problem with what's happening today is that the rate of what's happening is faster than what we've been able to document in the past, or the recent past. So it's happening very quickly. And 14,000 years ago, there weren't 7 billion people on the planet. And so like the climate was changing, but things were adapting, and species were moving, and there weren't people dependent on certain areas to grow crops, or people dependent on fresh water sources from certain areas. So I think the convergence of having a large human population, particularly one having a large part of that living at sea level, which is going to change and is changing rapidly, and then having this climate change that we're seeing today happen at a pretty fast rate is not a good thing.
All right. Does anybody have any final questions, or we can wrap up? I am going to put some information about our next Lunch and Learn into the chat. It's on April 15th, and it's about using the phone app iNaturalist to rediscover lost species. A presenter from the Vermont Center for Eco Studies will be doing that presentation, and I encourage you all to join us again in April. Thank you, Meredith and Ed, for joining us today. This was a great sort of wrap up to the work that happened a year ago, and I'm happy to learn more about what the outcomes were. So thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming, and thanks so much for the Upper Valley Land Trust for supporting this work. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. I second that. Thank you.
All right.